We are now 4 days removed from Election Day, and there's a whole lot to unpack, and there are races still to call. Late last night, NBC News projected that Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen will hold on to her Nevada Senate seat. NBC News has yet to call Senate races in Pennsylvania and in Arizona, but we know Republicans will control that chamber. Look at the map. Okay, the math is mathing. As for the House of Representatives, there are 19 races that remain uncalled. Republicans need to win just 6 of those seats to control the House. And with Donald Trump in the White House, we must remind ourselves that, none of this is normal. He's returning to office having been convicted of crimes and with retribution on his mind. Vice President Harris and Governor Tim Walz had this message for the road ahead.
Look, we know what's coming down the pike. We know it because they told us. And we're going to have to be ready to defend the progress that we've made here in Minnesota.
This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. This is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged for the sake of freedom and justice.
So where do we want to begin?
Let's begin with, okay, so I guess we could start at the presidency, right? There has been, and for folks watching throughout these 3 hours today, we're going to unpack all of the races. We're going to talk about all the different intricacies. We've got great guests to do that, people who know and like literally were on the ground. But I guess I have just talked to a lot of strategists, people who worked on the vice president and governor's campaign, people who worked in the states, and Democrats were just kind of, I guess, disappointed, really, really disappointed, because she ran a remarkable, she gave it her all. There are gaps in the campaign that we have seen, but she gave it her all. And to watch her go out there this week, she walked out to that podium and you heard a little shake in her voice, but she got through that speech. And I just think it was really important for people to hear. But, every Democrat statewide won in North Carolina except Kamala Harris, that was on the ballot statewide. There is something that, just Black women operatives have been talking about, just saying, we are tired.
She underperformed her numbers from 2020, the Democratic numbers from 2020. That's problem number one, despite an incredibly good ground game. Republicans didn't need a ground game because they played in the digital space. They had been targeting and reaching their audience long before. Because I was wondering, where was the ground game? Well, now we know. It wasn't on the ground. It was in the air, if you will. But the fact that both candidates underperformed, there were voters who sat out this race. There were voters who, as you just rightly pointed out, in the state of North Carolina and other examples where the down ballot races, Democrats did fairly well and won races, but she didn't. So there are a lot of elements that sort of went into making up her vote. And it doesn't help, in my estimation, to have the former Speaker of the House now coming out and second-guessing the race. And I guess that's part of the game. But that tells me that even from the beginning of this 110 days, 12 days, 15 days ago, that the Democrats weren't all in on this the way they probably should have been, to the extent that there was still this higher level of underperformance of this base in such a critical race. Particularly
I'm sorry, Michael, when you say underperformance, what do you mean? Like
the numbers. The
turnout, but that's not underperformance. That means people stayed home. Well,
that's underperforming. In my world, that's underperforming. I'm sorry, if you don't turn out your vote, that's underperformance. So you can, I don't know how else you cut that. At the end of the day, you got to meet your target. If I have 100 people show out in year one and 70 people show out in year two, then I've underperformed in turning out my vote, particularly in a race where the other side is all in. And look, I'm not saying that's a critical factor. I'm saying it's one of many factors that layered one on top of the other that made this race, in hindsight, a little bit more difficult for the vice president. than we thought in the moment. We thought the ground gaming and all the other pieces was going to do that. But then you did have the conversations we had at this table about black men who actually came home. They did what they needed to do. But white women, 52% stayed like, no, I want to go with the serial rapist and the adjudicated criminal and the guy who wants to deport everybody. It's same with white men, but even younger women went with Trump at a level that we didn't see from 20. So there were a lot of dynamics that I think kind of played into these narratives, which are going to be very interesting for all the political folks to sort of unpack. But they have to unpack it correctly to really understand what the voters were saying. Because at the end of the day, voters will tell you what they want. And some will argue that the Democrats didn't hear what the voters were saying. And I would say that going back to the time wasted on the filibuster in the first few months of the administration. But that's all cumulative for me. But I don't know what you guys think. You
both just have said important things that I want to make sure we take the time to unpack, and I don't want to skip over what it is Simone said about the fatigue. You referenced it as black women operatives, Simone. I think it's black women more generally in this country who are feeling the fatigue that you referenced.
I think and I would also say black people writ large.
Black people writ large. I mean, as both of you well know, I think among the many factors that were undergirding this was a global phenomenon of anti-incumbency that we saw play out in the UK, we saw play out in France, we saw play out in India. But Simone, I think you were pointing to something that is more uniquely American, and I want to make sure that we give it time to talk about it.
Well, Alicia, to this point about the UK and whatnot, one of the criticisms that people had of President Biden is that he talked too much about defending his record and not enough about, one, the future, and then two, kind of addressing all of the, one could argue, unfinished work, right? Like, he talks about America had the best GDP recovery of any G7 country, right? The best economic recovery. And all of that is true. If you go outside of the United States and you talk to our friends in Europe, they would love to have America's economy. None of them had what the United States have. None of them have tackled inflation the way that we did, led by President Biden and Vice President Harris. And so this overlaying of like, oh, well, this is just a phenomenon of pandemic fatigue and whatnot, that does actually not apply to the United States, because if you ask any other global leader, any other person in another country, they would say they would wish to be in the United States position. So this is actually not that. And I believe that, yes, there was misogyny. Yes, there was racism, right? Like, how in Wisconsin does Tammy Baldwin hold on and Vice President Harris doesn't? How in Michigan does Alyssa Slotkin win and Vice President Harris doesn't? Like, there are just some things that we have to, talk about. But also, many things can be true at the same time, as Michael pointed to. Their turnout was not the same for Democrats. Right. And so when you have a campaign that raises $1 billion, and now we are learning that they're in debt. The vice president's campaign is $20 million in debt, right? And it's my understanding from talking to people that they were in debt as of October. There's something to be said there. Like, how do these consultants and the strategists and the senior advisors and the media buying folks make out with all of this cash? The vice president is out there literally breaking her back, going out there to get everyone's votes, and then raising all this money, and then it's poof, we in debt. It just don't make no sense, right? And so one could argue that instead of spending most of the money on ads, which in the last finance report, that's what we have, that's the biggest line item, the paid media budget. And the paid media budget and the events, okay? Where was the money that could go to some of the groups that had been organizing folks for the last couple of cycles? Well, who does the organizing matters, does it not, Mr. Chairman? Well. And so there's some internal conversations I do think that the Democratic Party apparatus has to have. And I think the last thing I'll note is, after the election, everyone, like, collectively, people were like, oh, people have rejected progressivism and the left, and Democrats have just gone too far to the left. Like, it's just not rooted in reality. Republicans ran against Democrats on all of these issues that Democrats were not even talking about on the campaign trail. You know what I'm saying? And so one could argue that the culture wars have been the playbook right? And although they are a distraction, I believe, the culture wars are also the playbook. And so when not effectively countered in some way, shape, or form, go back to 2020 and the defund the police, right? Joe Biden was like, I'm not defunding the police. Because he fundamentally believed that, whether we wanted him to say that or not. Okay, that's what he believes. I just think that there are many things at play here, but the lack of turnout of base Democratic voters, to me, those people deserve the treatment that white voters in 2016 got in those diners. I want to see the journalists going to the barbershops and the disaffected rural black and brown communities and asking people why they didn't come out. Go to Fulton County and ask why was turnout a little bit lower among black voters, because that is the only way to understand why. We have to ask the voters why. This is not a lurch to the we got to win white men. Democrats ain't never won a majority of white men. White voters writ large, not since 1964. What is going on?
You still have to address your problem with white women, which they in 3 cycles now have undercut the efforts of the National Party and the candidate at the top of the ticket. There are also the aspects of just basic gameplay. Your messaging and to your point, Simone, not addressing in a counter move the negative response, the negative storylines. So you have a transgendered ad, $30 million buy, that ran during NFL games, that ran during sports events, and there was not one countermeasure to that ad for a very, very dangerous period of time, meaning you allowed that ad to resonate and sink in with the voters. To your point, even though no one was talking about that on the campaign, Republicans were directly with voters. And that's a strategy that I think Democrats are going to have to look at going forward as they sort of do this internal rework and soul searching about how they level up against an asymmetrical party. I think finally now folks know that Republicans follow the lead of their asymmetrical principle in Donald Trump and run these kind of campaigns that are everywhere all at once. And if you don't know how to play that level, you're going to find yourself, for example, with those types of ads playing over in this market while you're looking at something over in that other market that will come back to bite you later on. And I think this, there are a lot of other things, aspects we're going to get into in this conversation over the next couple hours about this campaign. But you begin to see some of those elements sort of taking shape in the last few days of this campaign, where the ad money was going in one direction, ad buys were going in another. So
literally highway robbery. Okay,
and as all of that is taking place, you also have the policy priorities of a second Trump administration coming into